Great, welcome back everybody. I would like to reintroduce our next panel on ERGs, Networks for Success or Tick Box Exercises. Once again, we're facilitating the panel. We have Peter Lewin from Levi's, we have Inez Menvi from Sanofi, Larry Lennox-Schott from Bain, as well as Jack Guest from HSBC. Welcome.
Hello. Good afternoon. All right, all that post-lunch energy. Yeah, incredible. So look, I'm really happy to be here again. I was up here yesterday and I'm filling in for Tulsi, who unfortunately couldn't be here. I've had a limited amount of time to prepare. I have not yet met our spectacular and accomplished panelists with any, Jack and I had a conversation backstage briefly. But please bear with me as I kind of like come up to speed with what we're trying to do here. And I hope we'll have a really engaging and insightful and practical conversation. So my name is Peter Lewin. My pronouns are he and him. I work at Levi Strauss & Company. I'm responsible for global direct-to-consumer strategy, growth and investment, and global membership. And I'm the founder and executive sponsor of Unlabeled, which is our LGBTQ+ and ally ERG for parts of the world, a lot of Europe and other parts. It just goes on and on. So let me introduce our panelists. In the room, we have Jack Guest, who is with HSBC. We have Larry Lennox-Schott, who is with Bain. And we have Inez Menvi, who is with Sanofi Aventis. Now, as I ask the panelists to introduce themselves, these three spectacularly accomplished panelists, I also want them to answer one question, which is why have they chosen to dedicate their lives, their professional lives, to this topic? So why don't we start with Inez?
Hi everyone. So I'm really excited to be here with you today. So I'm Global Diversity and Inclusion Partner at Sanofi, a pharmaceutical company. And for me, in my daily job, I have two missions. First one is to save patients' lives, of course, and bring the best medicines to our patients and customers around the world as a global leader in pharmaceuticals. But the second one is to make sure that we create a truly inclusive workplace and inclusive healthcare system. So I've been working in many countries with Sanofi, actually, especially in the emerging markets. Now I'm back to France, my home country. And I've been facing many different situations, meeting very diverse teams from around the world. And I know that they have all very unique needs. So that's why I decided to dedicate my life to diversity and inclusion in particular.
Thank you. Larry?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so Larry Lennox-Schott, I'm with Bain. I'm work as a director on our DE&I Center of Excellence team. And I wear a few hats, but one of them is Global Program Director for BeGlad, which is Bain's LGBTQ network. And why did I dedicate my life to this is a good question. I ask myself that all the time, actually. As someone who identifies personally as a member of various sort of historically excluded communities, the work is very personal to me. And a lot of, I encountered a lot of folks along the way in my journey who created opportunities for me by leaning in and creating different various support networks and various resources and things that I realized, I was a huge beneficiary of, and I would like to make sure that, that is available to others. And so like I said, I think it's very personal to me. So, so here I am.
Super, thank you. And Jack.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So my name is Jack Guest. I'm Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion for Wealth and Personal Banking at HSBC, which covers retail banking, contact centers, private bank, asset management, insurance, and a few others. It's approximately 95,000. But I'm also global co-chair of our Pride network at the bank, covering 27 markets. So ERGs are definitely my thing.
Thank you. So why don't we start with some definitions, right? And maybe we can do kind of a slightly rapid fire thing around, I would say, the room, but the stage. Each of you, please, could you give us your definition of ERG? Let's start with Larry.
I mean, it's a big question that we are actually in the process of answering right now at Bain. We're refining our answer because I think, you know, many of our affinity groups, and that's what we call them at Bain, we call them affinity groups, are decades old. You know, Be Glad has roots back to the 80s when it was a grassroots effort and then was formalized in the 90s. And obviously sort of like the remit and the need and the work that these groups do, all the programming has changed dramatically over the course of that period of time. And many other affinity groups have come into being since then. And you know, we strongly encourage these sort of grassroots community efforts within our offices to make sure that we're constantly sort of meeting the needs of folks, you know, in real time on a day-to-day on the ground basis. And so as more and more of these groups have sort of bubbled up, we decided that this was a good time to sort of step back as we're, you know, sort of quadrupling our investment in time and energy resources towards broader DEI topics. What specifically is the role of affinity groups and how would we define them? So, you know, in a month, maybe, hopefully we have like that final answer. We've got a few working drafts on, you know, what we think it specifically means for us, but I can tell you that the framework is traditionally for us has been built around identifying historically excluded communities who, you know, probably need some additional support within the specific rigid framework of Bain to ensure that they are thriving in their careers. Not just, you know, you can have this initiative on campus and hire a bunch of people and have a diverse class, but if they're not there in 2 years or making their way up through the promotion channels, then you haven't really achieved diversity or inclusion, right? So I think that's where our affinity groups, the answer for us is somewhere in there, but we're currently working on the latest and greatest answer on that.
I think that's a really interesting and important insight, that D&I and the way we address it in our companies doesn't stand still and constantly need to evolve based on the needs of, you know, society generally and also the company in its own place in its evolution. Ines, how about you?
So it's funny because it's a bit the same as Larry. We just conducted a massive audit internally and we realized that, and it was really a surprise, we have more than 50 ERGs around the world at Sanofi. And they are very diverse, they are very different. Some of them are global, some of them are regional, and some of them are local, country-based. And they also have very different sort of space to operate. So some of them would be just a Yammer page where people would connect and chat and exchange on their, you know, daily life at Sanofi. And some others would have a proper budget and a real communication channel and would engage teams beyond the community and truly, you know, advocate for change with the majority groups and with the allies. And so we realized that, and we thought we should give the same amount of you know, the same kind of framework for them to operate. So that's what we are also planning to launch on Q1 next year, making sure that they have, you know, a proper sponsorship from the top. They are still a safe space and people really feel they belong. So making sure that they are unique and tailored to the unique needs of our team, but also make sure that they have an overall same kind of impact on, you know, on their community, but also on our patients and on our business. So that's also a definition that is that we are rethinking those days. Very interesting.
Okay. Okay, so we've got 2 for 2 of our panelists who are redefining ERGs. Okay, fantastic. Jack, it's down to you.
Well, I realized that I actually skipped your first question in my intro, and I think I can hit 2 birds with 1 stone. You know, employee resource groups fundamentally are the voice of collaboration. So what I learned very on in my career, especially when I got into becoming involved in employee resource groups, is that it is the power of many when we speak out that can influence change. And so becoming a D&I practitioner and really supporting employee resource groups and getting involved, I could see very clearly that we were bringing a new perspective to the organization. We were being heard as an LGBT group of individuals, and we were actually seeing real change as a result of what we were telling our leadership. And I cannot think of any other opportunity or position in an organization, especially when you're starting your career, where you can have so much influence in the way an organization operates. So employee resource groups, let us not be mistaken, very much are internal lobbying groups, almost unions, to ensure that minority groups have their voice heard.
So let me thank you for that. So what I'm hearing is, we've got a long history of ERGs. We have ERGs who've been operating on a grassroots level, have been driving change. And now we're in a position where we can actually sit in a conference like this and have formal D&I professionals who are looking after diversity and inclusion in the organization and the relationships with the ERG. So this kind of raises the question, what should the relationship between the central D&I team and the ERGs be? What should that look like? Jack, do you maybe want to take that on?
Yeah, so, there's often a little bit of friction between diversity and inclusion function and an employee resource group. An employee resource group is really passionate. They want to see change happen really, really fast. They're lobbying it for it. And then D&I are quite often saying, slow down, calm down. We've got to do things in our own pace. I believe that they should be seen as level, separate, but level, and both working towards the same goals, but using a different approach. So a diversity and inclusion function will never have the capacity or the resource to change the way a business operates in the way it serves its customers, designs its products and marketing and literature, as well as some of its policies and processes. And so a DE&I function should really be to steward and guide the organization and those employee resource groups as to how they can be the most impactful with that passion. So ERGs are the ones lobbying for change, speaking to leadership, and the DE&I one is just the guardrails and making sure that passion is directed in the most productive way.
Thank you. Ines and Larry, I want to give you an opportunity to agree or add a different perspective.
Maybe I can just share a very recent example where D&I team has been partnering with ERGs and where it was a real success. In the US team, we launched Diversity and Inclusion Month during mid-October till mid-November, and where actually all the ERG were asked to come up with a speaker, proposed speaker to come, some raising awareness through some campaigns. We did a lot of meetings internally, talent events, etc. And that would have never been, manageable without 3 super great colleagues working on D&I. So they had to really connect with them, get their, their thoughts on the program itself, and make sure that, we bring to the table the best person that fits with the needs of those people. So I think that was really, a sort of partnership that works very well, and where the D&I team has been here to, raise awareness, make sure that that meeting was, let's say, promoted internally, connect with the ExCom members or with the leadership teams, bringing, the HRs, et cetera, and the ERGs were more here to look after the content, so that it resonates with everyone. So that's just an example.
So really adding their voice.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I don't disagree with anything that anyone said. Certainly, I think for us, and I'm really sort of like the first point you were making, that I like that they be equal, right? Like the ERG or the Affinity Group and the DEI Center of Excellence team. Absolutely. And I think as we are going through this exercise to redefine or rescope what is an affinity group and what should they specifically be driving, what are they sort of on the hook for, we're also defining that for the other pieces of the broader DEI ecosystem. And at Bain, that's really broad. We have the DEI practice, we have an IP team, DEI marketing, DEI recruiting, right? There's lots and lots of pieces of this broader ecosystem. And the affinity group is certainly like one of the sort of boxes on that grid there. So how we're thinking about it is that the ERG is specifically sort of responsible for, or what we think that they are most impactful on, is driving a sense of belonging. For us, inclusion is defined sort of as sort of like hitting it out of the park on belonging, support, and trust. We think if your employees are feeling those three elements in their day-to-day life, you've mastered capital I inclusion, right? And so that's what we're working towards. We think that our affinity groups have the greatest opportunity to influence that sense of belonging. That you can be open and authentic as your true self within the workspace, within your teams, whatever. That we feel like the affinity groups can really, really drive. But it's the Center of Excellence team that's going to drive the sort of support mechanisms, the additional layers of training, trying to fill gaps, whatever it is that we know that as we look at the data for this group historically, XYZ hurdles exist. We can get you over that with these like programmatic opportunities, right? So like that can be driven by the COE. And then it's really sort of up to like HR and global human capital to really deliver on trust, and trust being, confidence in the fairness and effectiveness of our systems and processes, right? And so all of this together, the ecosystem all working together, we can achieve our capital I inclusion goals, but no one owns all of it. And we certainly you can't put all of that on the affinity group that like, okay, you're this historically underrepresented group within our company. It's up to you to like figure out why and create all of the stopgap measures to bridge that, no, like it's absolutely a collaboration across the ecosystem. And it is really important that, like you said, everyone be even and equal partners, but really understand what it is that they own, and they're, we need to have like accountability measures in place to make sure that everyone's delivering on those things. And so it's a lot of communication forward, backward, left, and right. And the affinity group or the ERG, is obviously hugely instrumental in that being the voice of that community, making sure that the things that we're trying to do, endeavoring to do through all these programs and systems and whatever, are actually bearing out in folks' day-to-day life.
I love that. I love that structure of belonging, support, and trust. And then just also the very clearly defined roles and responsibilities and the way of working together to help drive it forward. I think that's a really lovely way to articulate it. So the title of the session is Networks for Success, or Tick Box Exercises. So I think what might be helpful is to understand what a tick box exercise is. Jack, why don't I put this one to you? How are we defining tick box exercise?
So listening to Larry just now, he said that the responsibility lies within three parts of the business. The employee resource group is the advocate, it's the vocal representation of the minority group that wants to be heard. The DE&I team are the advisory and the steward, but the executor is the actual business themselves. It's the leaders taking on responsibility and saying, you've raised up a concern, it's within our power to change it, and this is what we're going to do. When an employee resource group is a tick box exercise is when you don't have that dynamic. When the employee resource group isn't listened to, their advice is not being heeded, and they're really feeling like they're shouting into an empty void. And fortunately, it's not often the case, but it can be. But I think that we see that there's an evolution going from employee resource groups into business resource groups now. And some organizations are recognizing the value and perspective that an employee resource group can bring to the way that the business overall operates and gets a seat at the table. And so if you are joining an organization where the employee resource group doesn't have that visibility and really is starting to feel frustrated, then I'm afraid that is a tick box exercise.
Okay, so let's go into a little bit more detail on that. I find it really interesting. So you're saying a seat at the table influencing the overall business. At the same time, there are some people who have a point of view that an ERG is not a focus group, right? And we hear time and again that individuals or even small groups of people shouldn't speak on behalf of an entire population. And that idea seems, or an entire kind of minority, that idea seems opposed to what you just described. How do you reconcile between those two perspectives?
I think that absolutely, a minority group do need to speak up and speak on behalf of themselves, because if they don't, who's going to do it for them? And there are issues that are specific to minority groups. If we take the LGBTQ community, for example, we know that across many markets, you can't get same-sex insurance, right? Trans customers can't change their titles. And there are a lot of obstacles that LGBTQ people face when going, for example, into a bank branch and not being able to share their full family status because fear of being judged. And so the same with ethnicity, working parents, gender, so on and so forth. There are specific issues that are faced by these groups that if they don't get the opportunity to raise their voice and open the eyes of the business that these exist, then I'm afraid no one will on their behalf.
Yeah, Larry, question for you. We've got students in the audience who are thinking about joining companies, and there could be a risk to them if they join a company with a tick box type ERG approach. Can you help us all understand what exactly is that risk to them of joining a company with that tick box ERG approach?
Yeah, it's great, and I think it's hard to identify from the outside sometimes, right? I think one piece of advice I would give to anyone recruiting ever for anything is remember that the process is not just the company sort of kicking the tires on you. You should be kicking tires on the company. You should really be thinking critically about what it is you're being served, how much of it is the talking points that have been polished by the marketing team so as to be, the attractive, shiny thing on campus, and what is the actual lived experience of folks, right? So, and I think that that's how you're going to determine one from the other, is have those conversations with members of the LGBTQ, group within that company, if at all possible, to make those direct connections, and ask the critical day-to-day questions, like the things that are really relevant and pertinent and, of interest to you. Ask those questions directly of someone who lives that experience within that space. Don't take, the recruiter's word for it. Not that they're all lying to you, but, they have a vested interest here to convince you, right? See if you can't break that down by having that really sort of one-to-one human conversation with folks who, might be living that same experience and wondering, right? And one thing I wanted to add to what you were just talking about is, I think there's like an added level of complexity, with an affinity group or an ERG speaking on behalf of a broader population or whatever, when that group is global, right? If you are the, if we were like the US Be Glad chapter, right? Like we can speak about federal laws and things like very easily, right? But the reality of the LGBTQ lived experience across national borders, very, very, very different. And the societal and cultural challenges that we face as a multinational company with, nearly 80 offices around the globe in every, major city, it's just totally different, night and day in some cases between, two offices where we compare them side by side. So I think there's like incredible complexity for the group to speak as a monolith ever. And so, we take great pains to, we have some very specific Americas initiatives, some APAC initiatives, some EMEA initiatives, specifically hoping to eventually, our ultimate goal is that, a queer employee in New York or San Francisco feels the exact same level of support, belonging, trust, within the Bain organization as a queer person in, Dubai or Shanghai or, wherever. And for a lot of obvious reasons, like that's a huge lift, but it does mean that you have to, sometimes these things need to become local and maybe even hyper local if your ultimate goal is to, scale down to like the human experience that folks are having. And so like, that's something that we are always trying to layer in. It makes it extremely complex, but it's worth it. That's really, really worth it because we're actually impacting, the day-to-day on the ground lived experience of folks. And we sort of think of that as like, that should be our ultimate goal always, is not how Bain feels about these populations, but rather how these populations feel about Bain. And so that's where we can do that.
So I love this. You just made it so clear how important it is to have that hyper-local grassroots approach with ERGs to advocate for the people in their markets really need. But that's got to be very difficult to manage from a global perspective, to have that level of transparency. Do you have anything, there's some people here who are parts of ERGs, there's some people here who might be parts of global D&I teams. Do you have any advice for how to manage, because I think you need that kind of diversity to proliferate, right, in order to achieve change, but you also need visibility. Do you have any advice for how you can achieve that level of visibility?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a complicated web of advocates and champions who are working with us. You know, we have local office champions, we have regional champions, we have a global chair and lead council. It's tons and tons of communication. At Bain, we are big fans of feedback. And so we're always encouraging folks to share that up through the funnel. And so really open and constant communication is absolutely key to us, sort of like, you know, keeping our fingers on the pulse. But it's also partnering with all of the appropriate regional and local stakeholders, that some of these things, you know, in, you know, market A, someone might be saying, you know, we have this gap in our health insurance. You know, it doesn't specifically cover this, you know, gender affirming, you know, whatever it might be. You know, we can raise that up to the channel, but ultimately that decision lives with the HR benefits team in that market, right? So we're just sharing that immediately laterally and saying, you know, let us know how we support getting from A to B here, but this is the issue, but you own this, you have the D on this, so let us know, you know, what support we bring. But so it's a lot of that, like everything doesn't run up through the funnel and then we solve it from the center and push that out. Like, no, it's absolutely a partnership at every level, depending on sort of like what the situation is.
Yeah, so it's a function of respect and two-way conversation.
Yeah, totally.
Ines, I heard you say you have 50 ERGs, is that right?
Yes.
Wow. So, I mean, that's a lot to manage, I'd imagine. And I'd imagine that there might be an interest in trying to consolidate some of that. And this is an angle to a question that's on the list, by the way. I'm not making all of these up. I'm going to take it from a lens from a panel I was on last week, which is, the notion of an intersectional approach to ERGs, right? Which can take a couple of different lanes, right? One could be to combine ERGs and have like a diversity ERG. And another could be, getting the ERGs to work together. What thoughts do you have on an intersectional approach to ERGs and getting the most out of it?
So for me, it depends on the layers. So if you're talking about global ERGs, if you're talking about local ERGs, it doesn't mean the same. And the recent example about that massive event we created in the US, bringing all ERGs together, making sure that they share their voice, and also found out what was their similarities, but what was also their unique differences. And I think we shouldn't be ignoring neither, the unique needs of specific, communities or underrepresented groups. So I think that intersectionality is great because some people might identify part of ethnicity ERG, for example, diverse ethnicity ERG, but also part of the LGBTQIA+ ERG. So where do you want to dedicate your time? It's really important to make sure that some people with intersectional identities have a space also and have a voice. But at the same time, I think it's important to keep the communities dictate what they need, first of all. So I think bringing all the ERGs together, making sure that they have also spaces where they can share their common needs, and make sure we evolve our HR processes, for example, thanks to the feedback would resonate to all. I think it's super important. At the same time, some members of the ERG clearly say that if they didn't have that safe space with people where they feel they belong, it wouldn't be the same. So I think it's a bit of a mix that we need to find a way.
Yeah, the right approach. Larry or Jack, would you like to add to the question on intersectional ERGs? If not, I've got more questions behind that, so don't feel obliged.
We think that this is super important at Bain, and we've really been ramping up in the last 2 years, I think, specifically trying to create more and more intersectional programming opportunities. And again, like, this is something that's very personal to me. I'm a Latino gay veteran. I'm just by virtue of existing an automatic member of half of our ERGs, right? So it's extremely personal to me, like I said. So we are strong believers that no one is any one thing. And the opportunity to invest in the multiple pieces of yourself and celebrate all of those things, but not have them so siloed that they never overlap, that creates a very incomplete picture of that person and their experience. So for us, it's about creating those opportunities programmatically where the groups are collaborating across, right? So like during Pride Month, for example, our Be Glad partnered with all of our other affinity groups to have like a conversation about the intersections between, being queer and disabled, or being queer and Black, and, queer women, or, we had a transgender speaker talk about just like gender broadly. So we're thinking about it like programmatically in lots of ways, but it's also really important for us as a business to understand the experience of our, intersectional employees via the data, right? Like you can't like pull them all apart separately. And you're like, what if someone is, Black, woman, and queer, in our space? Like, how are they doing? Like, oh God, like let's look at the funnel, So we think it's like really important from like a business standpoint as well. So yeah, it's absolutely something that's like very high priority for us, and we're thinking about constantly. But at the same time, like we said, and it's super important at the same time to still have those communities where folks feel like this is entirely like a safe space that is just ours, and we can have this. But another facet of this that we think is really important is capital A allyship. It should not only appeal to the straight white men in your organization. As queer people, we are allies of our Black at Bain affinity group, and we're constantly supporting one another's initiatives, not because they're also taking on like a queer lens as they're thinking about this thing, but rather just if we all linked our arms, all historically excluded communities, we're actually not a minority, it's in our best interest to learn from one another and to share best practices and things. So we think of it as a strong, like I said, allyship opportunity as well within the groups and across them.
So thank you. We've talked a bit about the relationship between global DEI and the ERGs themselves. We've talked about intersectional ERGs, but what we haven't talked about is how do we deliver sustained organizational transformational change through the ERGs, or indeed whether or not that's possible. Jack, is that something that you want to take on for us?
Yeah, sure. So one of the reasons that I joined, one of the reasons that I got into employee resource groups is because in an extremely large and complex organization, I was working in a particular line of business with a particular team, and my knowledge of the organization was quite blinkered towards what was in front of me in my day-to-day job. And so I think everybody in this room and online, one of the main benefits of joining an employee resource group is to give you that wider perspective on the organization, to introduce you to people working in legal, communications, other lines of businesses, and to build up your knowledge of the organization to help you plan your career better. And I think that when you have that wider context and that wider view, you can start getting involved and start tweaking parts of the business that you wouldn't normally have in your day-to-day role. So being part of an employee resource group, quite often you can get involved with marketing campaigns, communication writing, policy changes, product enhancements as well that are specifically aimed to enhancing your particular affinity group's perspective. And so as part of an ERG and being involved in it, I've been really, really fortunate to get my hands dirty with some really interesting stuff. Writing new policy wording documents for insurance, working with creative agencies to produce a really engaging external campaign. And it's this exposure to change and process that I would have never had in my actual job. And so that's how I think you can get really involved in some of the extracurricular stuff that you wouldn't normally get exposure to in your career.
I think that's a beautiful idea. It's that you can develop skill sets that will help advance as individuals, will help you advance your career, which over time will drive more diversity in other parts of the organization as you shine, which I think is fantastic. Really, really beautiful notion. We've got 2 more questions on this list. And before we get to them, I'm going to add in one that somebody asked me to ask when I was down in the lobby. And it's the notion of fairness. And what this individual is, and this effectively will come down to resource allocation, but what this person, or it might do, that's the way I'm reading it, maybe it's the wrong way to read it. What this person is saying is we're trying to set up an ERG, and other ERGs are either not as organized as we are or not as proactive as we are, and consequently our organization is saying, well, let's hold it to the kind of lowest common denominator rather than trying to drive the spiky profile forward. Right now, I'm not a I've been involved with ERGs for a long period of time. I've got my own perspectives, but I'm not, kind of an official DNI professional, unlike the three of you. So I'd love to understand, and I'll leave it open to whoever wants to answer this question. What's your response to that? Like, what is the fair approach for to address this type of a topic, which, as I said, could also extend to resource allocation or even the ability to start an ERG, an officially sanctioned ERG?
I mean, I think I would need to ask some more questions, but it sounds like this company might be putting an unfair amount of onus on the individuals of these populations, these groups, to drive these efforts versus recognizing that some of this should be driven. Maybe the other groups are behind because they're so underrepresented within this organization, they can't, while also balancing their real job, whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing within this company, right? And so that becomes, that's extremely problematic for a bunch of, I think, obvious reasons as soon as you start digging. But so I think this becomes a bit of a question of, is this company actually truly interested or invested in this journey? And it sounds like they might not be quite yet. They might still be pretty early in sort of even recognizing the need or the value of these processes. I think a DEI journey has many steps, and the high end of it, of the graph would be truly living your most progressive and inclusive values, truly living it. But it sounds like this company might still be at sort of a reluctant compliance level, and not really trying to charge forward. So so it's a bit of a red flag, and that person should look at the careers page at Bain, because we are hiring, and we are not at that stage.
That was really funny, especially if you do the person. So, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I think this is where you can really use intersectionality to your advantage. Sure, you're getting pressure that other groups aren't as prominent as you, and I've certainly heard that myself. Pride tends to be really good at advertising themselves for some reason. They're quite often the most visible employee resource group. Maybe it's all the colors. But if you're getting that pushback, then it's time for you to use your platform to help others. It's time to bring in the disability network, the ethnicity network, into the advantage that you have by being a prominent group and supporting other groups.
So we had two more questions. I'm going to combine them into one question, so that maybe we have time for a couple of questions. So the combined question is, what do you see the future of ERGs as being? And what advice do you have for the students in this room who are looking to spread their wings and join the workforce?
Maybe I can start. So first of all, for me, a generic quote on diversity and inclusion. For me, diversity is like being invited to a party, while inclusion is being asked to dance. And that's the difference. And the last part is then where is belonging? And belonging is when you can dance like nobody's watching, and when the DJ plays your song. And that really, really resonates with me. And that's really, I think, the way forward for ERGs and for groups, generally speaking, who are really passionate about DNI, is how you make sure that people belong and feel they belong. That notion of belonging is super important, as well as psychological safety, which is a real intersectional topic. So I think that's really the way forward. And then what was your last question? Sorry, what was the, you combine it, so it's confused. Sorry, I got confused.
It was the future of ERGs and advice for students as they spread their wings to join the workforce.
Sure. So when it comes to my advice, and I would say focus on impact, impacting your organization and impacting outside of the organization. What your company can do, what do you master? What can you do? What's your, I don't know, what are your products? What are you selling? Who are your customers or your stakeholders? So that's what you need to keep in mind. Do something with a purpose, but do something that really impacts. Sometimes when you join an ERG, and let's not forget, it takes a lot of time and energy for people to, connect, keep in touch, and you have to deliver on your daily job. So make sure that whatever you want to tackle in terms of problematics or challenge, and whatever you want to make a change on, is really something that will create a massive impact in your organization, a massive impact for your community. It's not necessary to go for 10 different actions in 1 year. Just take one, but one which truly matters to your community, and one on which you can measure, you can communicate on, something that can evolve within the strategy of the company as well. So that would be my advice.
Thank you. Jack?
So I mentioned the evolution from employee resource group to business resource group. I think that smart companies will value this unique perspective that employee resource groups brings into the decision-making process of the organization. And the advice that I have for everybody here and online is, it can be really scary to enter a new organization and to expose such a vulnerable part of yourself, such as your sexual orientation and gender identity. And employee resource groups tend to be one of the routes that you can go into to start understanding whether a company is going to accept you for who you are. And so if you join an employee resource group and you're feeling that is, it's actually being detrimental and your line manager is not seeing that as a value, then I'm afraid to say the war for talent is hotter than it's ever been before. And you are entering the employment market at an extremely demanding time. So realize your worth. And if the company that you're joining doesn't feel right, you've tested the water and it's really not it's not going well, then you should realize that you are empowered to seek an organization that will value you.
Amen. Sorry, that's not a thing I normally say, but it was almost a prayer and I really agree with it. And Larry, finally to you.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with everything that everyone said. I think those are really great advice. So if you had to cut me off, I'd feel fine. But in terms of the future of ERGs, I think I hope that they will just continue to evolve. And evolve is a word that we've thrown around quite a bit today. I think it's so important that they be very reactive to the realities of not just the business, but also like the broader cultural and societal movements that all of our employees live in, right? Like we don't leave our queer identity at work when we go home. Like I'm wearing that all day. And I think that hopefully all of our resources and affinity groups are taking into account the constant movement within these broader identities and being really sort of reactive and supportive in the ways that are meeting the moment. And so I hope that they continue to just evolve in really interesting ways, that some of which we can't fully even imagine right now. Because I can tell you, what BGLAD is today is not what they thought BGLAD was when they founded it in the 80s, right? It's very, very different in really wonderful ways. And this actually dovetails right into the advice I have for students, because I think so much of that change has actually been driven by our newest and most junior members all around the globe. We do the vast majority of our consultant hiring straight out of undergrad and straight out of MBAs and PhDs and things. And so these students are coming into Bain fresh out of these universities and things where a lot of the latest and greatest progressive thought is bubbling up, and they're bringing these new bold ideas with them. And my advice to you all is to share that, to find the appropriate channels and ways in which to push your organization in that direction. don't let them off the hook, just because an idea is new or, hasn't been raised up by them. Like I said, so many of our best and most innovative and meaningful, impactful changes have bubbled up from someone very junior who just has their fingers on the pulse of what's happening in the broader world. And I strongly encourage you to share that and push your organizations. Understand that big, giant multinational companies, will not move at the, rapid pace always that you want, but sustained pressure and good ideas communicated thoughtfully through the appropriate channels, you have no idea the impact you can have.
Wow. That's so beautiful and inspirational. I mean, really, I can't think of a better way to close this out. I want to ask, do we have time for a question or two? And I see we have some questions. So I'll let you select whom to speak. And I see 13 things on the chat thing, but I don't know if those are questions for us.
Thank you. I want to follow up with the fairness question. So there's a lot of recent research saying that company with better DEI and a more active ERG perform better in business as well. So in a way, you can say DEI is also a business decision. And then each ERG group tend to think they are the most important one. So among like the race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexuality, how do you folks actually allocate those like a budget request from these different ERG group? And then in a way, what kind of metrics do you look into to justify the ROI? Thanks.
Resource allocation.
I'll say something first, right? So there are two approaches to budget. One is the administration of the employee resource group. And quite often employee resource groups will get a central budget, maybe $10,000 a year, just to run themselves. If you want to drive real institutional change, you want to drive a system enhancement to allow trans customers to change their title, or you want to lobby for a marketing campaign that raises awareness of disability in the workplace, so on and so forth. This shouldn't be paid for by a central D&I team. And I'll tell you why. Because if you want to see change embedded as business as usual within an organization, you can't have it run by a central team that pilots it and then expect the business to say, oh, very well, okay, we'll take this on as a going concern now and we'll take it out of our budget. That ain't gonna happen. You have to convince the business that why it's important for them to take it on from the start and have them budget and resource it as a pilot and then into business as usual. And so this is where sponsors are incredibly valuable, because having a business sponsor that is part of a P&L line, you can go to them and say, look, it's really important. We've identified that this is something the business is missing out on. We think that if we make this enhancement here or we make this change, it's going to result in this reward. And you can be the executive who chaperones that into business as usual. So I've seen so many pilots and initiatives start from being funded centrally and then just peter out because the eventual owners were never included in that journey at the start. And so it's much harder to convince them to take it on as a going concern halfway through. You've got to bring sponsors and executives in right from the beginning, get them to take ownership right from the start, and then foster that within the business to be a you.
Super, thank you. And I think there was one other question out there. Oh gosh, two more, okay.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I used to work for one of the UK's biggest companies and help lead the LGBT network there. And one thing, especially from this talk, has made me realize is a lot of the stuff was pushed centrally from HR. And if we ever had any ideas, even like pride parades and things like that, it was always thrown out the window until it was trendy. Now, how or what would you advise in that scenario to try and change the narrative and switch it up a little bit?
So just to make sure I got the question right, you mean in your past company, the HR team were the ones driving the action sort of and asking for ERGs to support, is that right?
Yes, so even if we're talking around doing something for Pride, if it wasn't on their radar, it was not going to happen. So when you're talking about new ideas, new invitations, especially when you talk around junior members, who were coming to me with kind of events ideas and other stuff. It was always trying to hit a bit of a brick wall. So how do you then change that kind of narrative to be more open, I guess, to these kind of events and other stuff?
Yeah, I think the sponsorship is key here. If you don't have the top with you, and if you don't have the leaders of the group supporting ERGs from the beginning, it's very hard to make things happen and move fast. And recently we had great examples where, thanks to our sponsors, we managed to make it, make things move far much faster than what it could have been from before. So I think that the sponsorship is key. And then it's about culture as well. So, call out the culture aspect of your group. For instance, at Sanofi, we say we need to stretch to go beyond how we operated so far. Anytime I'm having a pushback, I'm always challenging this on our culture slang. I mean, excuse my English, by the way. You hear me, I'm French, and sometimes I don't have the right word. But no, I think it's you can call out on the big claims, the big declarations that the group is making. What is on your posters on the wall, in the corridors, etc. Say, well, you're not showing this in your behavior. So I think that's also important, that it's a cultural change. There are some fancy ideas that sometimes it's true in very conservative or traditional sectors. It's a bit hard. But then just call out their own claims and make it happen. Say, well, you said a couple of months ago in a global webcast that X, Y, Z. Then, well, that's an opportunity for you to walk the talk. So I think that's actually currently my approach to it.
Super, thank you. And I think I saw one more question, if we've got time for it. The fellow in the Balmain sweatshirt.
Just whilst we're passing over the mic, I wanted to share a life's reflection with you all, which I think would resonate with this. Forgiveness is easier than permission. So if you have a really strong executive sponsor and they're bought into it, then, go for it and then get permission after. And I tell you what, some of the most bold changes that have been driven by individuals and resource groups have often been done at a little bit of a risk, right? But if they're done with the right heart and it's the right thing to do for the organization, and you have a strong sponsor to give you protection if it does go wrong, then ask for forgiveness rather than permission.
All right. Well, Peter, thank you so much for asking my question earlier. And Larry, this is Alberto. So I'm from the European office, so London. We used to be colleagues. But no, I think, my question was around, I think, going from an organization like Bain and, Sanofi and HSBC and all these great organizations that are so developed in terms of the structure that they have in place, the resources that they allocate to the ENI and all of this, and moving into a smaller organization where there's none of this structure, right? And it's not my full-time role to be doing that. I'm doing it on the side. And we're setting up ERGs. And I think my question would be, where do we start, right? Because I want to do recruiting. I want to do all of the stuff that I know we can do because I've seen it. But at the same time, we're limited, we're constrained, resource constrained, and we need to start somewhere. So we'd love to hear your thoughts about what's like step one to get that sponsorship and get it set up.
Yeah. Hey, nice to see you again. I think and I think Inez made like a really great point about like sponsorship being like so important to this, and as a launch pad for these efforts, it's so essential. And I think for us at Bain, even it's one step even further. At 10,000 feet, DEI, it cannot be a side initiative run by a few people because it happens to be trending and everyone needs to be able to point to something. It has to be absolutely embedded and central to your DNA and your values, right? And at Bain, we recognize as a matter of fact that our most diverse teams produce our best answers to our most complex questions that our case teams are working on. Like that is a non-debatable fact that our most diverse teams create the best, most innovative solutions. So for us, like that's the business case right there. It's right there, but it's also embedded in our operating principles that this is a value of ours, and it's, if you're not in line with this, that, you know, then maybe this isn't the place for you. You know, if you're a roadblock to that progress, we have stated it's on the wall. Like, this really, really matters to us. It's not just in the marketing materials because it's trendy right now. This is like absolutely essential to our business. So for us, like, being able to root back, you know, all of these efforts in that foundation that say, you know, this step that we're trying to take, we think is directly related to and linked to that which we have declared are our values. You know, this is how we're going to get there. No one can stand in the way of that, even if they, you know, if they wanted to. It's not as though I like have a ton of experience like fighting back bigots at Bain, but if I did, like, it would be easy to make this case that, like, this actually isn't up to you. You know, the global operating principles signed off by our most senior leaders say that this is one of the enumerated things that we really care about. So we have to do this. We're going to have a conversation about how, but not if. And so, you know, I think if you're able to zoom out and inspire your organization to define in really broad terms, like that foundation from which you can build, like having that shared language and shared starting point, from there, you can build something really great.
So super. I have a feeling that the cane's going to come out really soon and drag us off stage. So I just want to close by saying thank you to all three of our panelists, Ines, Larry, and Jack. I personally find your passion and dedication and vibrancy with which you engage on this topic and dedicate yourselves to this topic to be really inspirational. And I just feel like if we had more folks like you in the workplace, just imagine how much more equality and inclusion we'd be able to accomplish in the world. So thank you very much for participating and for your day-to-day contributions to the world.